First and foremost, I would like to thank you guys for clicking on my video, and if you stay all the way to the end, I promise you, you'll have the basic knowledge on how to build, cable manage your very own personal PC, with parts of your choosing, I must say. Now, before we get started, I know this is a full ATX case, and we are working with a micro ATX motherboard, but it's enough to get us started with the build. Now, let's build it out. Here we have our Gigabyte B550M DS3H micro ATX motherboard. Now, let's take everything out of the box and let's get the IO shield out and our SATA cables out of the box because we're gonna need those for later. So you're gonna set them aside and put everything back in the box that we don't need and close it up. Now that we have our box closed, let's grab our motherboard and set it on top of the box so we can use it as a non-static bench to build on. Now that we have our bench semi-ready to build on, let's go ahead and grab our CPU. Today we're going to use the Ryzen 5 3600. So let's set it aside so I can grab my knife and we can get ready to start the build. Now that I finally cut it open, let's go ahead and open this puppy up and get our CPU out. Here we have the Ryzen 5 3600 stock cooler from AMD. Let's go ahead and open it up. Now let's grab our motherboard and open it up and get it out of its static bench. Now that I painfully got it out of the bag, let's set it on top of the motherboard box and let's start with the CPU clamp. Let me note this, the CPU clamp is very stiff and you gotta be careful because I've seen these things fly across the room. Now that we have our clamp open, let's go to our motherboard and move the lever slightly to open and slide it up. Now, you gotta be careful and grab the CPU on its sides and try your hardest not to touch the shiny gold. Trust me, it is really shiny. Ryzen CPUs are the easiest to install. It has a golden arrow on top of the CPU and a white arrow on the motherboard or a black one inside of the socket. Now to install our RAM. You're going to want to skip the first RAM slot right next to the CPU and open the second one, skip the next one and open the fourth one. We're going to be running this RAM in dual channel since Ryzen loves dual channel memory. Note, while installing the RAM, you got to press firm in it to get the nice beautiful click. Now that we have our RAM and our CPU inside of the motherboard, let's go ahead and grab the cooler. Please note, this is the Ryzen 3600 stock cooler. As you can see, for a stock cooler, it's pretty good if you don't have another cooler laying around and you're not planning to overclock. This PC is going to be a stock anyways, we're not going to overclock it, but I happen to build a lot of PCs and have another cooler laying around. Here I have laying around a Ryzen 5 1600 cooler, the Wraith Spire. This one has a vapor chamber and everything, not all aluminum like you saw in the other one. That one is the same one you get from the Ryzen 1300. As you can see, with vapor chamber and all, it is a much better cooler than the stock one that we got. So let's use this one. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if you build a lot of AMDs, you get the AMD logo sideways. You either go over the RAM or over your IO. I personally don't like it, so what I do, I unscrew the 4 screws, rotate it 90 degrees one way, and have my AMD logo pointing up. You know, this is a free modification you can all do. Obviously, it's going to be a little bit stiff, but you can get it done with the right tools. Okay, now to mount the stock cooler onto the AMD, we gotta remove the cooler locking mechanism. So we're gonna unscrew 4 screws that are holding these guys in. We're gonna take them out so we can put our stock cooler right in. Okay, now that we got the factory mounts out of the way, let's grab our stock cooler and just drop it right in. Okay, let's be careful and not touch the thermal paste that was pre-applied to our stock cooler when installing. Unless you have some laying around, then it's okay if you reapply it. Now to install a stock cooler, you can align the 4 screws that come on the cooler to the back plate that is on the motherboard. Remember, we're going to reuse the motherboard back plate. When tightening down these screws, you're going to go in a cross pattern. You're going to start in one corner, jump to the diagonal to that corner, straight down or above or across, and just cross it each way around, tightening a little bit at it. Once you have installed the CPU, you're going to grab your fan cable and plug it into the motherboard. There's a section on the motherboard that has written on it CPU fan header, and you're going to plug it into that header. Now grab the remaining cable and tuck it to the side under the plastic of the CPU cooler. Okay, now let's grab our GPU. Today we're going to be using the Zotac 1070 8GB. Since the current CPU and GPU market, these things are very scarce. Right now you can find these guys during coronavirus and the crypto mining boom. You can find these guys anywhere from $350 all the way to $800. Remember, these cards never went for $800 MSRP in the first place. Crazy times we're living in right now in 2021. Okay, let me bring back in the motherboard on its motherboard tray, and let's put this GPU inside to pre-test everything outside of the case. Remember, I should have stated in the beginning, always build it all out first, test it, make sure it boots, and then toss it in the case. So let's plug this guy in. Okay, we got our motherboard, we got our RAM installed, our CPU installed, the CPU cooler installed, and the beautiful 1070 Zotac Mini installed. Now, what do we do next? Let's grab our power supply and see what we got. Oh my god, no, what is that? It's 2021. Why is there so many cables? Sorry, my dudes, I'm a little broke, but this is what you gotta do, so we do what we do. Okay, let's turn off the power supply and let's start this out. Let's start with the first cable. We have the 24 pin motherboard power supply. Plug that in. Okay, next cable we have the CPU power cable. As you can see here, you can split it in two. For some motherboards that only have 4-pin power supply, this one requires 8 pins. So as you can see here, it's still separated, but it's 8. So let's plug it back together and plug it into our motherboard on the top left corner. Okay, here is our PCIe cable that goes into our graphics card. As you can see, it's split into two, 6-pin and a 2-pin. You can put these together to make the 8-pin that most graphics cards use. So let's plug it right in. Okay, now that everything is plugged in, let's find out and see if it boots. Now, isn't that a beautiful sight? Power supply light turned on, CPU fan spin. I don't know if you can see the GPU, but the fans are spinning. We have power and everything is working. Here I am in the BIOS menu. As you can see, everything is connected and registered. Now let me grab my SSD that I already have pre-installed, the Windows 10 Pro. So let's grab our SATA cable that we got from our motherboard earlier, and we're gonna plug it into the motherboard and onto our SSD. Okay, after I connected our SATA cable to the SSD, let's look for a SATA power cable from our power supply and plug that in. Okay, now that I have both SATA power and data cables connected to our SSD, let's go ahead and boot it up again and see if we go into Windows. Now, would you look at that? Power supply is working, CPU is working, GPU is working, RAM is being detected, SSD is being detected, and here we are in the Windows screen. Okay, now that we confirmed our components are working, let's go ahead and grab our case. As you can see here, we have the Corsair's 220 RGB. There is the beautiful mid-tower case. Look at the tempered glass and everything. So now we remove the tempered glass, 4 screws in the corner. Okay, now that I have removed the tempered glass from the case, let's go ahead and set it aside. Most people put it inside of the box that the case came in for safekeeping. Okay, now to remove the rear panel, only has 2 screws, one on the bottom, one on the top, and they will stay inside of the panel. You will not lose these. Now that the panel has been removed from the case, let's go ahead and put it inside of the box with the tempered glass without breaking the tempered glass. Okay, here in the drive bay cages, you can see we have our screws that come from the case that the manufacturer sends with it, so we can use these to build our PC inside of the case. Okay, let's go ahead and set the screws aside, and we're going to use them later when we start building everything together. Okay, here is the back side of our case. As you can see here, ta-da! There's the RGB controller for our 3 fans that come in the front. And here is the basement for our power supply. As you can see, this case also has grommets to run your cables through to the front of the case. Okay, now let's go ahead and turn this case around and work on the front. We're going to go ahead and grab our I/O shield that we set aside from when we first opened our motherboard box. No, please make sure your I/O shield is properly installed. It has a right way and a wrong way. Okay, now with our I/O shield installed, let's go ahead and install our motherboard inside of the case. We're going to go ahead and grab those screws we set aside earlier from the case and grab our motherboard screws. Now with the screws in hand, let's go ahead and screw in our motherboard. Okay, we're going to go ahead and install 8 screws. Make sure you do not over tighten these screws. You can run the risk of ruining your motherboard. Okay, now that our motherboard is in place, let's go ahead and flip it around and work on the back. Now, as you can see here, I already moved the cables that were in the way out of the way so we can put in our power supply. Okay, now that we have our power supply, we're going to go ahead and install the power supply with the fan pointing down, since it has a fan intake for our power supply. So these cases are sometimes a little tight, so with a little bit of persuasion, we can persuade our power supply inside of the case. Okay, now here we have a little problem with our non-modular power supply. As you can see, we have all of these cables to put inside. There's no room, you know, that's the bad thing with non-modular power supplies. Bad. So let's go ahead and pull out the drive gauges and let's see if that helps. Okay, now that we see that our power supply does fit inside of our case now, let's go ahead and bolt it down. We're going to use 4 screws that were provided to us by the case manufacturer. Okay, now that we have securely installed our power supply, let's go ahead and grab our cables that we're going to need for our computer. Okay, here now we have our PCIe cable that we're going to use for our graphics card. We're going to go ahead and set that aside, and the extra ones we're going to put it that way. So what do we have next? Our CPU cable that we're going to need for our CPU, of course. You know, one side power, one side ground. We're going to go ahead and set that to the side. Now we're going to get our 24-pin cable for our motherboard. See, big chunky guy. Set that guy to the side. Now what we're going to look for is our SATA cables to power our SATA devices, hard drives, SSDs, this fan hub for our RGB. We're going to go ahead and put that aside. Now all the cables that remain are all extra. These cables we need extra. Okay, now what to do with these extra cables? As you see here, this is an old power supply, so we have Molex. No one uses Molex nowadays. Well, some case fans do. So we're gonna go ahead and toss those in the back of the power supply. Now for the next one, let's go ahead and put in one drive cage into our drive bays, and we're gonna put the rest of the cables that do not fit behind our power supply underneath that one cage slot. And here we have a 1TB hard drive that we're going to use inside of this system. We're going to go ahead and put it on top of the cage that we separated in the first hand. Okay, now let's go ahead and pre-wire our cables that are going to go to the front of our PC. So this is the PCIe cable. We're going to fish that through the bottom. Now let's go grab our chunky boy. No, just kidding. Let's grab the CPU power. We're going to go ahead and put it into our CPU slot side. Remember, you're going to pre-wire these in the directions you want to make cable management much more easier. Now, we grab our 24-pin motherboard power cable. We're going to go ahead and wire that up, and to save the power devices, just leave that back there for right now, since all devices are going to go in the back anyways. Okay, speaking of SATA devices, here is our SSD. Now let's figure out how we're going to put it up. Should we want the wires sticking up? Nah. Too much length and time, so let's point the wires going down. So we're going to go ahead and unscrew our SSD drive bay right here. You know, these things come tight from the factory, so use a screwdriver. No one's going to judge you, no one's going to know you did it anyways. Here you see me doing it, but oh well. So now we got our drive bay out. We're going to go ahead and put our SSD on it and mount that sucker in. Now please saw that you aligned the 4 screw holes into the same 4 screw holes that go into the cage, and we're gonna go ahead and get these screws that came from the factory. As you see, I don't know if you can see, they're really small and tiny. Camera doesn't focus for shit, but we're gonna go ahead and tighten down these screws onto our SSD. Now for these screws, you do not want to over tighten them. You will strip it and then you have bad news for everything. So right here I'm just lightly screwing them in, you know, lining them up all the holes, make sure our cage is nice and straight. And once they're all in there, we're gonna go ahead and tighten in a crisscross pattern. Don't do what I do as I say. Now that our SSD is onto the cage, let's go ahead and mount it back onto the case. Okay, now that that's done, let's get everything ready to run to the front of the case so we can plug it into the motherboard. You know, you got your front panel fans, your front panel connector, your front USBs, front audio jacks, whatever you need to feed through. Now is the time to feed it in. And while you're doing this, please try to keep it as organized as possible. You know, try to keep straight lines down, over and across to minimize the difficulty of cable managing in the future. Okay, now that that's done, let's go ahead and rotate the PC so we can work on the front. Now, as you can see, we have your PCIe cable, we have our front USB, front audio, motherboard power, CPU power. We have all the connectors needed to the front, so we can now lay down the PC and work on it. Okay, now that we have the PC laying down, we can now plug in everything into the motherboard. For example, this USB 2.0 cable, we plug it in right here into the header on the motherboard. But as you can see, it has a little key and it's a keyed slot, so there's no way to put it in backwards, upside down, or whatever, you know, one way in, one way out. So once we got that plug in, let's go get our front audio panel, and it should be right here in the front corner, usually there, and it has like one pin missing and there's a pin missing on the connection, so there's no way to mess that up, and you can just put it in straight in. Okay, now that we've plugged that in, let's grab our USB cable. Now this USB cable comes from our IQ RGB lights, so we just plug it into our USB port. And now we're going to grab our reset switch, power LEDs. Some cases have like hard drive LEDs to blink to indicate that they're working and everything. This one only has a power LED, so there's less things to plug in. Now you got to look at your specific motherboard to get the front panel plugins for switches and resets. Usually all the same. Okay, now we grab our 24-pin motherboard power and we're gonna plug it in. So I don't know if you noticed, the motherboard has a little lip and the power cables have a clip that clip in onto that lip. Now let's go do our CPU power, and the CPU power, like I said, is usually on the top left hand corner of the motherboard, and usually feed it into the top left hand corner to the cables. So like the same thing as the motherboard power, it has keys for it to like lock in place. Now that we have finished putting in all the cables, we can now put in our GPU. Now remember, we're going to put in the first PCIe slot, and we're going to line it up to see which slots we had to take out. As you see, this is a 2-slot card and is going to require 2 slots on our back. So we're going to go grab our screwdriver and unloosen up the 2 screws that hold in the brackets. Now that we loosen up those screws, we're going to save those for later, so we're going to need them to tighten in our GPU. Now we can just take the covers out that were in the way. Once we have removed both covers, we can now grab our GPU and proceed to insert it into the first PCIe slot and make sure it clicks in. Now remember the 2 screws that we got. Let's go and use those to tighten down our GPU onto our case so it won't be sagging or anything. Now that we have it tightened up and everything, we can grab our PCIe power cable. Same thing as the motherboard and the CPU cables. They have a little clip and a slot that it locks into. I don't know if you remember how I said that it was a 6-pin plus 2 pin, making it an 8-pin cable, and this graphics card requires 8 pins for power. So now that we have it connected, we have this leftover slack of cables. Let's go ahead and push it inside of the hole where the cable came out of, exactly where the Molex cables are in the basement. Okay, now that you have done that, we're gonna make sure that our cables look nice and vertical, you know, straight lines. If you have to show a cable, make it nice and presentable. Okay, as you see here, we're missing one rear fan, but I got one right here, so let's put it in. Okay, as you see, this case came with 3 fans in the front, so we're gonna grab this extra fan and we're gonna put it in the rear, so we can have 4 fans in the case. Okay, now let's prepare our wire and make sure it's placed properly and it won't be in the way when we screw it in. Okay, now let's grab 4 fan screws that came with the box of the case, and we're gonna go ahead and screw in the 4 screws. Okay, now that we have 4 screws, I like to leave a little loose so we can move it left, right, or up or down in this case, so we can align it in the same direction as the CPU, and we're gonna raise it up a little so we can pull more of the hot air out of the case. Now we'll grab our fan cable and plug it into our motherboard where it says System Chassis Fan. Okay, now that we have that done in the front, we can flip it over and we can start a cable management. Here I have a pack of colorful zip ties that I like to use in my cases. It just adds color, you know, I don't mind them. Okay, here in the background while I'm opening this, I was talking to my wife. And we're trying to choose what color to use, you know, pink, yellow, orange, blue. And she's like, why don't you use blue, you know, it's the same color as the power supply light. So, blue is the color we're going to use for our tie downs. Let's get started. Okay, while I put this away, let's get started with the points of beginning. I usually start with my CPU power cables. You know, I usually have more fan cables running to the back, but this time I didn't have any. So it made it much easier and cleaner. While a lot of people will suggest to freaking tie them in on strap them down tight, I usually recommend leaving them a little slack, you know, like that you can pull the cable, push the cable if necessary to get a nice clean cut. Now, if you paid attention, I missed my front panel connector and other USB cables that I am going to add them into my CPU route. Okay, if you notice, I added another zip tie in between the zip tie as a cross. I like to divide my cables, you know, to get a nice, clean, straight line, make it nice and flat. Even though it's long, it's going to be flat, and I'll be able to get my panel on without any hassle. Okay, now I did this off camera and I forgot to record it. That's my mistake. But I added to my last chassis fan header on my motherboard a fan splitter. You know, since we had the 3 front fans and they have their own fan power. Okay, now let's do our motherboard power cable. And as I'm wiring this up, I noticed that that it's up and over when it should have gone under and across, you know. So we're just gonna deal with it right now. So there's nothing we can do unless we take it all apart and rewire it all. But since it's just a quick fan, I'm just gonna wire these in and zip tie it, give it nice and free slack to push and pull when necessary. And yeah, now I don't even know if you remember my box, my box of cable ties, and I'm just right here struggling to get this small one in with all of these cables. I remember, like, why struggle? I have a big cable tie, I can wrap all of these together in one go. Look at that big cable tie with little dividers to make it flat and wide. That way we won't have a big bulge and it will stop us from putting our rear panel back on. Okay, now that that's done, let's go ahead and try to wire in our front fans. Right, I remember I said I wired in this fan splitter. Oh man, SATA power. That's right, the Corsair iQ requires SATA power. So, while I remembered, why don't we wire up our SATA power devices? No, first we're going to start with the flat one. That's going to be the hardest one usually if you have the middle part. So we're going to get the tip of our SATA cable and try to go under it all and plug it into our SSD drives. Now let me make a note here. The power supply to the SSD drive or hard drives are keyed, and I had it upside down. So we're gonna go ahead and make sure that the key is facing the right way with our SSD to plug it. Okay, after we plugged in our SSD, let's go ahead and plug in our hard drive. Once our hard drive is connected with the last spot, let's fill in our iQ from Corsair. Now we have everything plugged in. We're gonna move our Molex cables or something and tuck all of our cables back into that basement, you know, some behind the power supply, some underneath our hard drive cage, wherever we need to put it so it can go in, look nice and clean, and our back panel will close up. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's go ahead and grab our front chassis fans. We're going to grab all of the cables for the RGB, and we're going to set them aside for right now so we can grab our fan connectors. We can plug them into our splitter. If you remember with our chassis header, these fans have a keyed way, so there's only one way to put them in. Doesn't matter if there's pin missing or not, it's gonna be okay. Now that we have all of our fans connected to our splitter, we're gonna go ahead and run straight lines, and we're gonna set them onto our sides that we're gonna be our more dominant side, and we're gonna try to start zip tying them up and tucking them in and wrapping it all up together so we can get this cables all wrapped up and cable managed and out of the way. Remember to leave these loose so we can run our cables, if they're extras, back through the loops over and under to get into a shorter distance to where we want to plug it in. That's why we always leave it loose until the very end. Here's a little tip: if you bend and solidly fold the zip tie, it'll make it easier to fish it through under a bunch of wires. Okay, now let's plug in our final cables, which is our fan RGB lights. We're going to plug them into our iQ hub, and remember how I said to leave them loose? This is the exact same reason why you leave them loose. Okay, now that we are doing our final zip tying points, we can finally, and we're happy with our cable management, we can start locking it in place and tighten it all up. You know, nothing's more satisfying than tying them all up and seeing how everything pulls and lays down together and flat. It's just beautiful. Okay, and here we have some electrical pliers that we're gonna flush cut right next to that little ball so we don't cut ourselves down the line, because trust me, I know, I used to be a mechanic and zip ties are a pain in the ass. And you know, nothing's more satisfying than cutting the zip ties and watching that piece fly. You know, it might hit you in the eyeball, it might hit your cat, who knows? But the funny thing is, it's going across the room some way, somehow. Okay, now if you were paying attention, you might have noticed that I completely forgot to plug in my SATA devices with the SATA data cable. So, you know, I'm human, I make mistakes, so we're gonna correct that right now. Okay, once we're happy with our cable management, we can go ahead, grab our rear panel and cover it up and watch it lock in place. And just like that, you have officially built your own personal PC. Man, look at that, our RAM, CPU cooler, plugs, connections, my cable management. You know, if you gotta make the cables visible, nice vertical. And if you made it all the way to the end, I would like to personally thank you for watching my first how to build video, and you are an amazing guy. You can now build your own PC to your personal specs. Thank you for watching. Hope you have a great day.